Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Candyman, which I have on VHS. Now, I already reviewed Candyman all the way back in 2014. That review is still up, however, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can still see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2014 review of Candyman. Now, Candyman is a supernatural horror film released in 1992. I was also released in 1992, but that's not as important. Now, Candyman was written and directed by Bernard Rose, who prior to this directed Paper House, and the film is based on a short story entitled The Forbidden by Clive Barker, which was published in Barker's 6-volume anthology, The Books of Blood, specifically Volume 5 of that series, which was published here in the States as In the Flesh. Now, I have read the short story, and I'll address some of the major differences between this movie and the book later on in this video. Now, the way this video is going to be structured is the first section is going to be my standalone review of Candyman, then I'm going to cut to some friends of mine giving their thoughts on this movie, and then the third section of this video, which might end up being the longest section, will be a more in-depth discussion on this movie with my friend Bill Burns. Now, I'm going to be honest, as much as I love Hellraiser, Candyman I think might be my favorite Clive Barker adaptation, and I think this is one of the most criminally underrated horror films of the early 90s. I mean, sure, people know about it, and it's one of the most famous horror films ever made, but the reason I say it's underrated is because I think it's one of the most misunderstood movies ever made. Because I think when a lot of people look back on this movie, they just think of it as some cheesy early 90s slasher film, and it really is a lot more than that. I honestly don't even consider it to be a slasher film, and in my opinion, this is a much deeper and far more psychological film than it's given credit for. It's a film that very much deals with themes of race, class, and belief systems, and how even in a modernized city like Chicago, there can still be legends, there can still be superstitions, and the movie's also about how sometimes superstitions and urban legends can be a reflection of real-world horrors going on in society. And I think it's grossly unfair that Candyman has sort of been lumped in with a lot of slasher films like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Not that those aren't great movies, and actually the first Nightmare on Elm Street I do actually think is a little bit deeper than people give it credit for, but that movie still very much fits into the slasher category. Candyman I don't consider to be a slasher film at all. To me, this is much more of a psychological ghost movie, and I would compare this more to films like The Shining or Jacob's Ladder or Angel Heart before I would compare it to any slasher film. Now, I remember I first saw Candyman when I was 11 or 12 years old, and at that age I had already seen most of the Friday the 13th movies, most of the Nightmare on Elm Streets and Halloweens, and I thought this was going to be kind of like that when I saw it, and now at that age I didn't grasp the deeper themes of the film, but even at that age I recognized that this was a much more intense and adult horror film than I was used to. Now, what the plot of Candyman is, it's set in Chicago, and it follows this grad student named Helen Lyle, who along with her friend Bernadette are doing their thesis on urban legends and how they reflect society, and she hears about this one urban legend about a figure known as the Candyman, an evil spirit with a hook for a hand that can be summoned when you say his name 5 times in the mirror. She, of course, thinks this is all bullshit, but what fascinates her about the legend is the fact that a lot of people of the Housing Project, Cabrini Green, actually believe in this legend and actually attribute some murders that have taken place there to this figure. So she starts looking into this legend and actually goes to Cabrini Green to talk to some people there, despite the fact that this is a very gang-ridden territory. She eventually learns that according to the legend, Candyman is the ghost of an artist who lived in the 19th century, who was a black man. He was the son of a slave, and he fell in love with a white woman and got her pregnant, and the girl's father hired a lynch mob to go after him, and they systematically tortured, humiliated, and ultimately killed him, and now he comes back as this evil entity. Now, she doesn't believe this legend, but she does become obsessed with it, and ultimately she's confronted by the real Candyman. Candyman ends up abducting this baby boy, as well as committing a series of murders, and Helen gets the blame for it. Now, one of the reasons why I differentiate Candyman from your typical slasher film is this is one of the most well-acted horror films that I could think of, especially from Virginia Matson, who plays Helen Lyle in the film. Her performance in this movie is electrifying, and I think even people who don't like horror films should be able to acknowledge that this is one of the most powerful performances in any horror film. Helen starts off the movie as a likable, if not somewhat arrogant character, and as it goes on, you see how her life is becoming this horrible downward spiral, especially when people think that she's a murderer and a child abductor, and she ultimately ends up getting committed to a psychiatric hospital, and you feel so bad for what she's going through, and the film is almost a tragedy where you see what becomes of this poor woman's life when all this happens to her. And as it goes on, she becomes kind of intimidating herself, and you get the idea that she really is starting to go kind of crazy. One, because of the weight that's on her of all these people who think she's some kind of a sicko, but also because she's actually being confronted by a supernatural entity, something that, as far as she's concerned, shouldn't exist. And this is where you could almost compare this to the works of Lovecraft, where the true horror of Lovecraft's stories was not so much in the monsters themselves, but in the psychological dread of the characters seeing the monsters and the insanity that's brought upon them by discovering that these monsters exist. And there are scenes in the movie where Candyman is sort of seducing and hypnotizing Helen, and those scenes are so beautifully shot. Now, supposedly Bernard Rose actually hypnotized Virginia Matson for those scenes. In the film, Tony Todd plays Candyman, and it is also an amazing performance. Tony Todd is seriously one of my favorite actors, and I think he is a criminally underrated actor. Now, I actually met Tony Todd twice. I met him once in 2014, where I got him to sign my VHS copy of the movie, and then I met him again in 2019, where I got this picture taken with him. Now, when I met him again, I didn't speak to him about Candyman, but I did get into an interesting conversation with him about his role on the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor, where he played the older Jake Sisko, which, by the way, that is an amazing episode. And he portrays Candyman as being both creepy and sympathetic, because you are meant to feel sympathy for this character. He's the ghost of a man who was murdered simply because of the color of his skin. He was the victim of a hate crime. Now, at the time this movie came out, there was some worries that the film might be considered racially insensitive because the main villain is a black man, but the point of the movie is not that he's the main villain, it's why he became a villain. He's a monster because of the horrible crime that was committed against him, and he's one of the most tragic and sympathetic horror movie villains that I could think of. And some of his dialogue in the film is so elegant and poetic and even romantic, and there is elements of sort of a tragic love story, especially with the implication that Helen might be the reincarnation of the woman that Candyman was in love with when he was human. Now, Tony Todd said that he was actually trying to channel Lon Chaney with his performance as Candyman, particularly Lon Chaney's performances as the Phantom of the Opera and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. But I also saw some parallels between Candyman and John Milton's version of Satan from Paradise Lost. Now, Paradise Lost was an epic poem published in the 17th century, and it was a retelling of the biblical story of Adam and Eve, but it was primarily told from Satan's point of view, and that poem portrayed Lucifer not so much as the embodiment of all evil, but rather as a tragic hero. And there's a very famous famous line from that poem, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," and I think that quote could definitely be applied to Candyman. Because you could consider the afterlife that Candyman is in now as a kind of hell, yet it's a hell that he is very much embraced, because he has now become a myth and a legend, which he describes to Helen at one point as an exquisite condition. And Candyman in the afterlife has, in essence, kind of become a god, and in the film he uses a lot of Christian terminology, like, he refers to the people who believe in him as his congregation, as his believers. And you realize that Candyman is trying to become like God is. And you realize that what keeps Candyman alive is his legend and people's belief in him. And killing Helen and killing the baby boy that he's kidnapped will add to his legend, and more so, it will make them part of his legend as well. And I think one of the main points of the movie is that Helen became so obsessed with this legend that she's now become a part of this legend, and even if she's not the reincarnation of Candyman's lost lover, she's going to take on that role. The movie also stars Xander Berkeley, who some people might recognize as John Connor's asshole stepfather in Terminator 2. He also plays an asshole in this movie as well. In the film, Berkeley plays Helen's husband, Trevor, and he is a dirtbag in this movie. He doesn't really treat Helen that well. Like, he's not, like, openly abusive towards her or anything, but you can tell he's sort of condescending towards her, and eventually in the film you do find out that he was cheating on her. At the same time, though, I do think Xander Berkeley plays this character a little more three-dimensionally than people give it credit for. Another great performance in this is Vanessa E. Williams as Anne-Marie McCoy, who is one of the residents of Cabrini Green and is the mother of the child that Candyman abducts. Her performance in this is also pretty powerful, and the scene where she's crying and screaming over Anthony's empty crib and she doesn't know where Anthony is, that scene is fucking terrifying. You also have Cassie Lemons, who people might recognize from The Silence of the Lambs as Helen's friend Bernadette, and Ted Raimi, who is Sam Raimi's brother, has a very small role in the beginning of the film. And I gotta mention Anthony B. Richmond's beautiful cinematography in this movie. He also shot Don't Look Now. Like, the film's opening credits take place over these absolutely gorgeous aerial shots of Chicago. And as I mentioned before, the scenes between Helen and Candyman are so beautifully shot and visually interesting to look at, and that combined with Philip Glass's beautiful score truly make this film a work of art, in my opinion. Now, much of the film revolves around Cabrini Green, which was a real housing project in Chicago that was actually torn down in 2011. And the film was actually shot at the real Cabrini Green, and from what I understand, what's portrayed in the movie is not that far from the truth. And apparently some of the extras we see in the scenes taking place in Cabrini Green were not actors, but were actual gang members that Bernard Rose hired to be in the film. And because of the actual gang activity that was going on in Cabrini Green at the time, there were serious safety concerns for the film's cast and crew. And supposedly on the final day of shooting, there was actually a bullet hole found in the camera van. But the fact that the film was shot in Cabrini Green and had real gang members in it really gives the film an air of authenticity and realism, and really makes the film feel like it's set in the real world, feel like it's grounded in reality despite all the supernatural stuff that's happening in the film. But when it comes to the supernatural aspects of the film, it also depends on if you want to interpret those as being literal, because there's actually a theory surrounding this film. Now, the sequels completely disregard this theory, but the theory is that it was actually Helen committing these murders, that Candyman was never real and Helen had some kind of psychological breakdown. Now, I don't completely buy into that theory, especially because the ending of the film clearly shows that something supernatural was going on. However, I actually don't think all the things you see in the film are meant to be taken literally. And I have a theory of my own about this movie. Now, this is just looking at Candyman as a standalone film and completely disregarding the sequels, because the sequels would contradict my theory, but my theory is that something supernatural was going on in the film, but I don't believe Candyman was literally the ghost of Daniel Robitaille. Rather, I believe Candyman was an entity that was brought to life by people's belief in it. And the whole story of Daniel Robitaille might not even be real, but it might just be sort of a folk tale that was made up by people of the black community to sort of cope with the traumas and the injustices that were done to them. But because enough people believed in the legend and the story became real, and Candyman became a living, breathing entity. So my interpretation is that Candyman is a living story. He's a story that's come to life. Because you see in the movie how the people of Cabrini Green are sort of using Candyman as a way to cope with the real-world horrors that they're having to deal with. And again, a lot of the film is about how urban legends reflect society. And also, some of the murders that you hear about in the beginning of the film that were supposedly committed by Candyman, I don't think were actually committed by him. Rather, because people believed they were committed by him, it added to the myth, it added to the legend, and allowed this entity to come to life. Like, you have the opening scene where a college student is telling Helen about the legend of Candyman, and she tells this story about a babysitter who's killed by Candyman. That's the scene with Ted Raimi, and that's the one scene in the movie that does feel like it's from your typical slasher film, but I think that was also the point, because I don't think that scene was meant to be interpreted literally. I don't think that scene literally happened in the universe of this story, rather it's just an urban legend. And then you have the murder of Ruthie Jean, which some of the residents of Cabrini Green believe was committed by the Candyman, but I don't think it actually was. I think it might have been something gang-related, but again, because people believed that Ruthie Jean was killed by Candyman, it added to his myth, and it benefited the real Candyman. And then you have what I think is probably the film's most chilling scene, where this little boy named Jake is telling Helen about this other little boy who was actually castrated in a public restroom, and he believes that it was Candyman who did it, and some of the other residents believe it was Candyman who killed this little boy. And again, I don't think it was actually Candyman. I think it might have been some sicko or something who did this to this kid, but again, it added to the myth. But I gotta point out, whether you interpret the murder of that little boy as actually being by Candyman or by just some sick fuck, that scene I do think is one of the most haunting scenes in any horror film. Like, you just see the poor kid lying in a puddle of his own blood, crying out for his mother. That scene is both heartbreaking and terrifying. And I think the fact that Candyman can be summoned by saying his name 5 times in the mirror is really important, because I think mirrors are really important in this film. It's this whole idea that Candyman is a reflection. He's the mirror image of the fears of urban society. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video that I have read the short story The Forbidden that this movie is based on, and while the film stays true to the basic plot and tone of the story, it does change quite a bit. For example, the short story is actually set in a fictional ghetto in Liverpool, England, which is where Clive Barker grew up. And in the story, Candyman doesn't actually show up till the very end, and is quite different than his counterpart in the movie. In the short story, Candyman's not even black, and you never find out where he came from or who or what Candyman actually is. You don't know if he's a demon or a ghost or possibly some kind of deity. And actually, in the short story, Candyman is actually described as being pretty grotesque looking. Now, there was social commentary in the short story, but it was more so making a statement about social classes in England, whereas the movie, while definitely dealing with class, Bernard Rose also added the element of race. And he moved the setting from Liverpool to Cabrini Green, and he decided to use the movie to make a statement about class and race issues in America. Now, Candyman, I believe, was a pretty big hit when it came out, but I think over time, people forgot just how political the original Candyman actually is, and just how many deeper themes are actually in the film. Now, the movie spawned 3 sequels, and I think at least the first 2 sequels definitely made Candyman more of your typical slasher. You had Candyman Farewell to the Flesh in 1995, and then you had Candyman 3 Day of the Dead in 1999, and the most recent sequel, simply titled Candyman, came out this year, 2021. And Candyman has become a horror movie icon, with many people ranking him right alongside the likes of Freddy Krueger, Jason, Chucky, Michael Myers, the Tall Man. And the movie has also been parodied many times. I specifically remember South Park's parody on Candyman, where it was the ghost of Biggie Smalls who could be summoned when you say his name 5 times in the mirror. Now I want to cut to some friends of mine giving their thoughts on the original Candyman. Then I'm going to cut to the discussion with my friend Bill Burns on this movie.
Before I was ever consciously aware of actually seeing the Candyman films, I would say around being 4 or 5, my aunt would have my cousin and I go into the bathroom, and she would prompt us to say Candyman in the mirror 5 times. Of course, she would sit back, and we would never reach the 5th, because we knew that something was going to happen. Damn, I'm sure we never even got to the 3rd, because we were terrified that something was going to happen. Somehow this myth had infected us. I would say experience like that left me feeling like I had a predestined connection to these films. That said, I find Candyman to be perfect. Be it the film, the atmosphere, the visuals, the aesthetic tone, the story itself that answered and left a mystery and then later revealed in the other films. It's perfect. The story itself is drowned in eroticism, and I would define eroticism in the way that Schwimmer defines it as assenting to life to the point of death. Helen and the child, obvious symbols of the family that Candyman lost. And this is later explored, this aspect of regaining lost family. This is explored in the movies to follow after this even further. But the entire goal, I found, was that Candyman was trying to get back his family that he lost, and to have them in eternity. But that eternity is death. Death is eternity. It's the unknown. It's the mystery. It's what comes after the finite. So to bring them together in death was to have them back forever. And, you know, what I find interesting throughout the first 3 films is that the world that Candyman is providing an exit from is not one that, or I would rather say it's one that no one would in their right mind want to be a part of if they were desired something better, and something better in eternal love, right? The world that we first see in Cabrini is riddled with crime. There's no belief, there's corruption, there's violence. And this proceeds throughout all of the films, really, even through the 3rd and the remake, or the 4th. And what brings us to an even more special point is how the film and reality of its setting subvert each other. You know, from the fact that there's real bees used, there's real gangs, real housing projects, and then also to the point of actually hypnotizing Helen, and sort of her forgetting, you know, complete shoot days in this process of hypnotism. Be it real or not, the story here, you know, reality is bleeding into the film, and the film is bleeding into reality. And we can see here that these 2 realms, when they clearly bleed together, it's something like surrealist perfection. It's like the dream and the waking world coming together, right? A perfect synthesis, a perfect surrealist film where, you know, we know that Clive Barker, as much as The Forbidden is related to Candyman, was clearly inspired by Bataille, and Bataille, you know, was adjacent, if not in ways a dissonant surrealist, that it works on all levels of surrealist principles. The most important in this case, I would say, is desire, and how desire, rooted in fascination, grabs, compels, and completely leads everything. It's Helen and a desire for the perfect story. It's Candyman and his desire for Helen and family. It's the viewer's desire for coherence, revelation, and resolution.
There's a reason why you gotta be careful giving kids horror movies to watch. And that reason is simple. Some kids, not all kids, there's a lot of smart kids out there. There really are. But some kids, like me and my friends when we were kids, we were stupid. We truly believed that if you said Candyman in the mirror 5 times, that Tony Todd, not Candyman, mind you, Tony Todd was going to jump out of the mirror and kill us with his voice. So, you know, you just want to be careful what movies you give to kids, because you never know if they'll take them literally. And we kind of did. Till this day, I have never actually tried standing in front of a mirror and saying Candyman 5 times. I still will not do it. I don't know if maybe I carried that stupidness into adulthood. I don't know. But yeah, Candyman is one of the legendary horror films. It is one of the ones that if you tell people, you know, to sit down and watch some horror movies for Halloween, Candyman is one of the films that should be on that list, because it is a brilliant film. For the fact that there's a mystery in it. It's beautiful how the mystery, you know, plays along. I won't go into too many spoilers, but there's a mystery that keeps you intrigued. But then also, too, the fact that you have Tony Todd. Tony Todd is one of the greatest actors ever. His voice is fantastic, but the way he carries it is just, he makes you believe he is this psychopathic killer, and the voice is so hypnotic. It really messes with you. And I just love his voice. I think that he has one of the greatest voices of all time. And he himself, he's really scary. He's a great actor, but he can really, you know, make you think he's a monster. And it's beautiful. I love it. It's great. The acting in it, this is a great film. The violence in it, it's very violent. So I would just be careful about that. It's based on a Clive Barker story. And that already should tell you what you're in for, because Clive Barker is one of the most violent writers ever. He just is. He writes really scary stories, but a lot of them are very violent. And you know, you just have to be really careful if you're a queasy, to be careful, you know, to not watch this, and then next thing you know, you're puking in the corner. And the other thing too is that if you have a fear of bees. I really won't say why, but if you look at the cover of the movie, I would recommend you not watch this movie. If you have one of those fears, like, you know, I don't know what it's called if you're afraid of bees. It's like arachnophobia, but for bees. Just be careful, because you will be terrified of this movie just by seeing what you see in this movie. It's crazy. And I love this film. I think it's one of the best. I saw it when I was a little kid, like I mentioned, and I've seen it many times since. I watched it, I think the last time I watched it was maybe, I think it was for Christmas time. Because for Christmas time, I'm weird. I like to watch a lot of horror movies for Christmas. It's a really weird obsession of mine. But yeah, Candyman, I highly recommend you watch it. I think that if you haven't seen it before, you need to jump on it and watch this movie. If you have seen it, just watch it again. Support this film. It's just a masterpiece, and show it to other people. You know, just spread the word of how beautiful Candyman is. And please do not say Candyman in the mirror 5 times. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Hello everyone. Christian asked me what my thoughts and opinions are about the original Candyman film from 1992. Candyman is one of my favorite 90s horror movies. The 90s horror movies were a hit or miss decade of being parodied and the start of remakes. Candyman is one of the best 90s horror movies, along with Misery, The Silence of the Lambs, The Blair Witch Project, Jacob's Ladder, and In the Mouth of Madness. Candyman was fresh, original, amazing, brilliant, great, and spectacular. It also showed that there were still original horror ideas back in the 90s. Tony Todd as Candyman is one of my favorite horror villains and one of the best horror villains ever. Here's a little fact. Eddie Murphy almost played Candyman but was turned down because the studio could not afford his salary. Maybe Eddie Murphy could have done a good SNL parody of Candyman, but it's hard to imagine anybody else other than Tony Todd as Candyman. I think it worked out just fine using Tony Todd. His secret underground lair is like the Phantom of the Opera. I met Tony Todd in 2016 at Monster Mania. He was fun, awesome, and a cool dude to talk to. I asked Tony Todd was he stung by the bees and was he allergic, and he said no, he wasn't. I don't know if I'd be brave enough to have bees on me making a movie. Not even if Hollywood paid me good money for that. The look of this movie is like a psychological dream and nightmare you want to wake up from. Virginia Madsen is great in this film as Helen, very sympathetic and feel bad for her for pain that Candyman is causing her. I never read Clive Barker's short story it's based on, The Forbidden. I'd like to check it out at some point. I love Clive Barker's work. I wonder how this movie could have turned out if Clive Barker directed it, especially how he directed Hellraiser 5 years prior. I never saw the sequels, and I'm curious to check out this, sequel/reboot to Candyman. Thanks a lot, Christian, for asking my thoughts and opinions about Candyman.
Candyman is one of the best horror films to come out of the 90s, and also just one of the best horror films in general. It's based on the short story The Forbidden, which was written by the legendary Clive Barker, who was also an executive producer on the movie. The film does a pretty good job of staying faithful to his original short story, while also expanding on it in a way that feels fresh and interesting. And I like how the first part of the movie is spent building up the mystique of Candyman and how it follows the journey of Helen and Lyle to discover more about this terrifying legend. You hear stories about him killing people, and they're all extremely gruesome and chilling, especially the one about the poor boy in the bathroom. And I also love the graffiti artwork on the walls of the ghetto that Helen explores. It's very creepy and foreboding. When Candyman finally appears, he does so in glorious and terrifying fashion. I just love the part where Helen is walking alone in the parking garage and she suddenly hears his voice calling her name. It's just such a perfect way to introduce him, and Tony Todd does an amazing job with his portrayal. His voice is so deep and creepy, and it's just perfect for Candyman. I had the pleasure of meeting him at Monster Mania back in March of 2016, and he was very nice. I asked him if having the bees in his mouth was painful, and he said nope. And I also asked him what working with Brandon Lee on The Crow was like, and he said he was a great actor, gentleman, and he knew that he was playing the role of his life. What happened to him was a tragedy, and it shouldn't have happened. But if you've got to die, die doing what you love. I got him to sign my Hatchet poster and also a photo of him as Candyman. But unfortunately, by the time I got up to his table after waiting in line for a while, it was slim pickings for photos on his table, so I had to settle on an image of him in Candyman 3, Day of the Dead. Ugh. I later got some more photos signed by him from a private through-the-mail signing, including the poster for the most recent Candyman movie, which I also got signed by Clive Barker. I also got a cameo video from him in which he told me that he got the role of Candyman after Bernard Rose saw him in a movie called The Last Elephant, and thank God that happened, because as I said before, he is just amazing in the role of Candyman. He's great in a lot of roles he plays. I also enjoy watching him in the Final Destination and Hatchet movies, and he's also just a very nice guy. Virginia Madsen is also very good as Helen Lyle. She's very strong and assertive, but also has a reasonable degree of vulnerability to her. And I love how she's not afraid to stand up for herself, whether it's to her husband or this really obnoxious colleague named Purcell. I also really want to mention how much I enjoy watching the character Purcell. He's just so condescending, and he's such a douchebag, but at the same time, I find him to be an entertaining douchebag. Another thing I really love about this movie is the amazing musical score by Philip Glass. It has such an ominous quality to it, and it just goes so well with the story. I like how the movie also shows the devastating power of Candyman, not just in killing people, but also his ability to destroy someone's life, which he does to Helen Lyle. Helen is a very tragic character, and during the movie we see her go from respected graduate student to mental patient who everyone thinks is a deranged murderer, and in the case of one very obnoxious orderly, someone to be patronized and condescended to. You really feel the agony she's going through, and Virginia Madsen is very compelling to watch. I won't give it away, but this movie definitely has one of the most satisfying endings I've ever seen in a movie, and this is just a fantastic and terrifying movie, and I'll always be grateful that Clive Barker wrote The Forbidden, which led to this movie being made. I had the honor of meeting Mr. Barker 2 years ago at Monster Mania, and he was incredibly nice and gave me a lot of great advice on my writing, which I actually got on video.
I just want to show a little bit of the video that Jeremy shot of Clive Barker answering his questions. Just letting you know that the video was shot a little bit off-center.
Can I just ask, what advice do you have for aspiring young writers? I try to write myself.
What kind of writing are you doing? Short fiction?
Short stories.
Short stories? Well, firstly, I think you need to look at who is publishing short stories. If you're writing them, have you written them already? Have you
I
written
have.
them already? Then go to the library or go to the bookstore and look at who's publishing short stories, and see it's not a great market for short stories right now. Because there used to be a lot of magazines that would publish short stories, and you could take them from the magazines and put them into books. But there aren't that many of them, unfortunately. So you need to basically do research into who is publishing the kind of fiction you're writing. Yes, and then you don't have an agent, right?
No, I don't.
No, it's no worries. I didn't when I started either. So
Really?
yeah, you just have to sort of have the balls to just go out and send it out and say and expect to be rejected. I got rejected a lot, but I sold Thief of Always for $1.
Really?
Yeah, because they didn't want to publish it. And I said, well, look, if I charge you $1 for it, will you publish it? Because I'd written a lot of adult books, and they didn't want me writing children's books. Okay, so you have to be willing to horse trade with them, do a little bit of back and forth thing, right? And the consequence of that was, I said, I'll give it to you for $1. You publish it, but you have to give me 15% as opposed to the 8%, which was the usual percentage. And they said, thinking that the book would not work at all, they said, sure, And of course, they've regretted it to this day because it's in 45 languages now. Wow. And so they don't always know what they're talking. Publishers don't always know what they're talking about. If you have faith in what you're doing, and obviously you do, you just need to keep at it. I mean, if I had one piece of advice, I would say, don't take no for an answer. Just keep at it. Yeah? And publishers don't know what they want until they've published it.
I also got him to sign my Hellraiser photo and poster. I later got my photo with him signed through a private through-the-mail signing, along with a poster for this movie, an 8x10 photo of the poster for the new Candyman movie, and a photo of some Pinhead artwork. All in all, I love this movie. If you haven't seen it, then I recommend watching it ASAP. Also, definitely check out the short story, The Forbidden by Clive Barker. It's very good as well. And even if you have seen the movie already, definitely give it a rewatch.
I hope you enjoyed their reviews on this movie. Now I'm gonna cut to me and my friend Bill Burns, who is a college professor and author, talking about this movie, and in our discussion on Candyman, we do get into some spoilers, and some of the things I've said about Candyman in the first half of this video, I am gonna be reiterating in my discussion with Bill. Bill, what do you think of Candyman?
Oh, I think it's an amazing film. I remember I think I saw it in the movies when it came out. And again, I think it kind of was in line with how they sold Hellraiser, as Pinhead was this sort of like slasher kind of, villain. And I think they kind of sold Candyman like that a little bit. So again, I was very impressed going into the film. I thought it was going to be more of a, stalk and slash kind of film. And then just the metaphors in the film, the sort of the ideas about urban lore and urban legends and how that sort of feeds into sense of place, I thought was really, really fascinating. I thought it was an amazing film. In a weird way, even though the subject matter is very different, it actually kind of reminds me of The Shining in the sense that Candyman is really a movie about class, about race, about trauma, right? About sort of not only individual trauma, but also sort of a country's trauma. Right, about especially in terms of like slavery, So in some ways, Candyman and The Shining are both about unhealed historical and social wounds, right? That they're not healed because of the fact that sexism, racism are still with us, and they keep coming back. Just like how the caretaker keeps coming back in the Overlook Hotel. Candyman keeps coming back in Chicago because again, Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. I mean, there's a real color line in Chicago. So again, I think Bernard Rose was brilliant to sort of move this from Liverpool to Chicago and really sort of moved it from not just looking at sort of class and economic level, but also looking at race.
Now, did you read the short story by Clive Barker?
I did, actually. Way back I did. And it's funny because I didn't think, until Candyman came out, I think I even forgot about it. Like, it didn't really resonate with me until the movie came out, Because I think when I initially read it, it was good. It reminded me very much of, like, Ramsey Campbell. Like a Ramsey Campbell story. It takes place in Liverpool. And Ramsey Campbell's horror is very much about sort of the terrifying aspects of living in a city, living in Liverpool. That's kind of like, the sort of storefronts and the alleys and the tract housing, and about how sort of horror could lurk even in those spaces, which really connects Candyman to like the larger, right now, I guess the two big horror sort of tropes now, right? A folk horror and something that's called the urban weird, right? Folk horror, as we know, is, stories where sort of nature, the woods, have this sort of, are terrifying for human beings, and these sort of old, antiquated sort of rituals and communities are still sort of alive in the woods, in the countryside, in the rural areas. And then you have the urban weird, which is sort of takes that and puts it into the city, right? So it's the fear, the fears, the isolation, the uncertainty that city dwellers feel living in these vast metropolises, these artificial metropolises, right? But even within cities, there's sort of hidden areas, alleys, subways, high-rise buildings, where this stuff can be uncovered. And so for me, Candyman really is an example of this urban weird, right? You think that, well, in a city, this is a modern city, it was built by, technicians, and that, superstitions and those kind of things are sort of, that's something for like the backwards rural areas. The city is scientific. The city is, modern and on the cusp of what's going on, yet horrors can still dwell, right, within cities.
Yeah, and something that I think is really fascinating about Candyman, and the short story touched on this a little bit, but it really is a story about belief systems, and it's also about how stories, myths, and legends change over time, and also how people in a society can sometimes use a myth or a legend to dodge real-world horrors, to sort of lay the blame on something supernatural or try to ignore what's really going on by creating a mythical figure. At least that's kind of how I read Candyman.
Well, it's funny you said that about belief systems, because, I mean, even though sort of folk horror and urban weird have very different settings, I think at the heart they have the same kind of fear at the heart, because both folk horror and urban weird are about the clash of belief systems, right? One belief system that is more modern, that is more sort of logical, more reasoned, more intellectual, right? Like Helen's academic background. And then you have another belief system, which is older, which is steeped more in spirituality, which is steeped more in the supernatural, superstitions, folk kind of beliefs. And that's what you get in both kind of films. We have the clash between those two kind of belief systems, two ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, now, a way I interpret Candyman, now, this is just looking at Candyman as a standalone film and completely disregarding the sequels. Obviously, the sequels completely disregard my theory here, but I have sort of a theory that Candyman in the film is not literally the ghost of Daniel Robitaille. Rather, he's an entity that was brought to life by people's belief in him. And even the whole story of Daniel Robitaille might just be that. It might just be a story, but because enough people believed in it, the legend sort of came to life. What do you think of that theory?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. It kind of reminds me of Carl Jung's view of the collective unconscious, how we all share these, because we're all human beings, we're all the same species, we all share certain stories, we all share certain symbols that resonate for all human beings. And it's the continued sort of belief in these things that keep them alive. So again, I think that's a very Jungian way of looking at the film.
Even like some of the stories you hear about Candyman in the beginning, like that prologue with Ted Raimi, where you see Candyman killing the babysitter, that might just be a story. That probably didn't even happen. And then even some of the murders that the people of Cabrini Green attribute to the Candyman were probably just random murders because people believed it was the Candyman. That's what added to the myth, added to the legend.
Well, I mean, aren't science and the supernatural just two different forms of trying to sort of understand the world, to sort of come up with reasons why things happen, right? Things that we have no control over, things that that happen by chance and accidents. Right? And again, that's what stories are, right? It's an attempt to make sense out of a world in which we don't have power. We can't control everything. So we come up with a story to give some kind of reason to it, some kind of purpose to it. And, right, science does the same thing. Science is trying to make reason out of what happens in the world to us. But I think stories, legends, lore, folk tales did the same thing, even before science.
Is there sort of this theory in the film that it was actually Helen committing these murders? But that kind of gets contradicted at the end, where it's clear something supernatural was going on. But at the end of the movie, you see, spoiler, Helen dies at the end of the film, but you see her ghost show herself to Trevor at the end of the film. But my interpretation, and again, this is disregarding the sequels or anything else, is that wasn't literally the ghost of Helen. Rather, it was the same entity as Candyman, but because the story's changed now, it's now Helen who's the new boogeyman. So this entity has essentially shedded its Candyman form and is now taking on the form of Helen, and Helen's going to become the new boogeyman or protector of Cabrini Green, depending on how you want to interpret the ending. And that's even the whole point of that mural of Helen at the end of the film, is Helen's the new legend. Candyman is dead. Helen's is the new urban legend of Cabrini Green.
Yeah, I think Helen is a much more important character than Candyman is in the film. She's the vessel now to keep these stories alive. She's the vessel that's going to remind people of the racist, sexist sort of history of America, right? So she's that vessel that's going to keep these things alive. And again, I think it's really important that it's not a white male that is the vessel, right? Even though Helen is upper class and she's white, but she's a woman, right? Another oppressed class, just like, right, African Americans were. So again, it's important that someone that has been oppressed keeps it going, and I think that's why it's important. That's why I think it's so important that she's a woman, right? Because again, she is upper class, she's educated, she's white, but we live in a patriarchal society in which women are oppressed, right? And so she is part of that oppressed class. So I think that's important to continue the story, that the story is being continued, okay, not through an African American man anymore, but rather it's being continued through a woman who also went through her own oppression, right? Look at the way that Trevor treats her. Mm-hmm. Deceives her, lies to her, right? Makes her feel low, right? Because of what she's studying. So again, it's this idea of oppression. I think that's really what's going on.
And even before she finds out that Trevor's cheating on her and all that, when they're at that dinner, you have Purcell, I think is the character's name, that colleague of Trevor's. He's so condescending to Helen, and you kind of get the idea that all the men at that table are very much condescending to both Helen and Bernadette, because they're women.
Absolutely, right? They're second-class citizens, just the way the African Americans are treated as second-class citizens. Women, no matter what color they are, in a patriarchal society, are going to be treated as second-class citizens.
Now, what did you think of Virginia Madsen as Helen Lyle?
Oh, she's great. I thought she was really gives a totally underrated performance in the sense of one of the great female performances in horror, and again, I think she was always a good actress, but I think she really raised her game in this film. I think she's fantastic.
And what you think of Xander Berkeley as Trevor, which I gotta ask, has Xander Berkeley ever not played an asshole in movies?
That's a good point. Yeah, he's great in this. He is so, you cannot stand him. He's the typical kind of academic who looks down on people, thinks he's superior, right? Thinks that he can use and manipulate people. Yeah, he's not a good guy, yeah.
At the same time, though, I think Xander Berkeley plays him very three-dimensionally, especially at the end, where after Helen dies, you can see he's heartbroken over this. Even though at this point he does believe Helen is a murderer, he still feels tremendous guilt over what he did to Helen. And so I think the character of Trevor is a little more three-dimensional than people might give the character credit for.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's a great performance, but again, it's such a great performance that you focus on those the characteristics that you really despise, and maybe not see those other characteristics that you're talking about.
Now, what do you think of some of the residents of Cabrini Green, like the character of Anne-Marie McCoy, played by Vanessa Williams?
Yeah, I think they were great, and I think that Bernard Rose really does an awesome job of treating them as three-dimensional characters. Not using stereotypes, not feeding into, this belief that, well, they're poor, they're African American, they must be criminals, they must not care. These people care tremendously about their community, about each other, about their children, So I think he does I think Bernard Rose did a really good job of portraying these people as real people.
Because I know when the movie came out, there was some controversy, because I think if you're just looking at it on the surface level, okay, if you break it down, you basically do have a black man preying on a white woman. I mean, that is sort of the surface level way you could read the movie, but of course the film's not really saying that. It's a much deeper film than that. But what do you think of some of the accusations of racism that might have been leveled against the film?
Yeah, I think it's someone who's not looking deeper into the film at all. I think it's somebody who just sees the surface, sees the facade, and doesn't realize this film is saying exactly the opposite, right, about oppressed people. That sort of, in some ways, oppressed people, unfortunately, sometimes take on the roles of the role of the oppressor because it's been sort of it's been inflicted on them. So that's what happens, right? Candyman becomes a murderer, a sort of somebody who brings suffering because he suffered himself. He was murdered himself.
And what do you think of Tony Todd as the Candyman?
Oh, he's awesome. I remember one time they said that they were thinking about Eddie Murphy to be the Candyman. That would have been horrible. I mean, Tony Todd is amazing. I also read, too, I believe that he actually came up with the backstory.
Yeah, I've heard that, too. I heard it was both him and Virginia Matson who came up with the backstory for Candyman.
Well, that's awesome. That shows you how committed he was to the role. And I love it because one of the things I really like about the film, too, is that even though he is like a monster, technically, I guess, he is very urbane. He's very sort of almost romantic. He is like this, if it wasn't for all that bad stuff, he'd be like this romantic character, this sort of suave romantic character.
He's one of the few horror movie villains where you can say he was truly wronged.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I mean, he is a metaphor. He's a metaphor for all those, crimes that were done against people of color. So again, we could look at him as an individual, but I think it's more rich to look at him as a metaphor for that trauma, the sort of the racial trauma in the history of the United States.
Well, again, that kind of goes back to my theory that Candyman's not literally the ghost of this murdered man. The whole story, that might just be a story. So again, I kind of view Candyman in this movie as just a story that has come to life.
Yeah, sure. I mean, stories outlive people all the time.
What do you think of Philip Glass's score for the film?
Oh, I think it's awesome. I think it really fits the film so well. Philip Glass is an amazing musician, minimalist composer. His other score that kind of reminds me of this is Conan Ascasi, that score that he did. And I think it's great. I think he also did a score for Dracula, too. I think for the 1931 Dracula with Kronos Quartet. So he definitely, Philip Glass very much, I think he understands horror. It also reminds me a little of György Ligeti's music. He's a Hungarian composer who was used in 2001 in Eyes Wide Shut and in The Shining, actually. And there's a piece in 2001 called Requiem that uses voices very similar to the way that Philip Glass uses voices in Candyman, so it's kind of reminding me of that. But I think it's great. I mean, the synthesizer tones, the weird kind of like carnival-esque organ, the layering of voices, really haunting.
So, any closing thoughts on Candyman?
Yeah, I mean, amazing film. I still haven't seen the new version, the one that just came out. I guess it's a reboot, or I haven't seen that yet. But I think it's going to be hard to top. For the original. I mean, I think Bernard Rose just hit on all cylinders in terms of making this not only an intriguing film and an entertaining film and a horrific film, but also, again, addressing some of the larger issues about class and about race and about, sexism in American society. So I think he did an amazing job. It's a deep film that, again, people who say horror films are, junk or, they're not as important as other types of genres really should look at this film.
Absolutely love Candyman. I think it's one of the most underrated horror films of the 1990s. It's underrated simply because a lot of people just take it on face value and don't realize the film has a lot more to say than it's given credit for, and I don't consider it a slasher film. I really don't. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. That was my review on Candyman, and my next movie review will be on Candyman 2, Farewell to the Flesh.